The Soil Surveyor of Enna 7. A Slow World's Bedtime Story. Part 1. Arrival at the survey station. The shuttle had gone 3 hours ago. Yara Okonkwo stood at the edge of the landing pad, watching the last traces of its engine light dissolve into the grey-violet sky of Enna 7. The fog swallowed everything here. Sound, light, the sharp edges of things. She found she didn't mind. The survey station behind her was a modest structure, a pressurized dome the color of weathered bone, half buried in the volcanic hillside as protection against the winds that came down from the northern ridges. Smoke rose from a small vent near the top, carrying the warmth of the heating system out into the cool air. Someone had been here before her. Someone had left everything ready. She picked up her equipment case and walked back toward the station, her boots crunching softly on the dark volcanic glass that covered the ground like scattered obsidian. Each step made a sound like shifting sand, or perhaps like ice settling in a glass. It was a good sound, a quiet sound. The door of the station recognized her biosignature and slid open with a gentle hiss. Warm air rushed out to meet her, carrying the faint smell of coffee and mineral dust. The previous surveyor had left the heating set to 22 degrees. Yara decided she would keep it there. Inside, the station was smaller than it had looked from the outside, but comfortable in its smallness. A workbench ran along one curved wall, covered in neatly organized sample containers and analysis equipment. A narrow bed occupied an alcove near the back, made up with clean sheets the color of storm clouds. A small kitchen area held a kettle, a few packets of dried meals, and 3 jars of coffee, more than enough to last her rotation. Through the curved window above the workbench, she could see the fog shifting and rolling across the landscape, occasionally parting to reveal glimpses of the valley below. Enna 7 was a moon, technically, orbiting a gas giant that hung perpetually on the eastern horizon, a massive presence she could feel more than see through the haze. The giant's reflected light gave the fog its purple-grey luminescence, a soft glow that never quite faded, even during what passed for night here. Yara set her case down on the workbench and began to unpack. Spectrometer, sample collection kit, field journal, actual paper, because she liked the feel of writing by hand after a long day. A small photograph in a frame, which she placed on the shelf above her bed. Her daughter's face, gap-toothed and grinning, taken 2 years ago on the day Yara had left for her first off-world assignment. She would be here for 90 days. 90 days of soil samples and mineral analysis, of quiet mornings, and long walks across the volcanic plains. 90 days of fog and solitude and the kind of deep, necessary silence that had become harder and harder to find on Earth. She put the kettle on. Part 2. The first survey. The fog was thickest in the early morning, if morning was even the right word for this place. The light from the gas giant shifted through a cycle that lasted roughly 18 hours. Brightening and dimming in slow waves that Yara's body was still learning to interpret. She had set her alarm for what felt like dawn, the period when the fog began to thin, and the volcanic glass fields caught the light in ways that made them easier to navigate. She dressed in her survey suit, a lightweight layer of thermal fabric that kept her comfortable in Enna 7's mild but perpetually cool atmosphere, and gathered her equipment. Sample containers, soil probe, portable spectrometer, a thermos of coffee, a small pack of dried fruit for later when hunger found her in the middle of the plains. The door slid open and she stepped outside. The air was cool and damp against her face, carrying a faint mineral smell, sulfur and iron and something else, something organic that she hadn't yet identified. The fog wrapped around her like a soft blanket, diffusing the light until everything seemed to glow from within. She could see perhaps 20 meters in any direction, before the world dissolved into grey. Her first survey point was a kilometre to the northeast, in a depression where geological scans had suggested interesting mineral deposits. She set off at an easy pace, her boots finding purchase on the volcanic glass with each step. The ground here was ancient. Millions of years of eruptions and cooling had created a landscape of frozen waves and gentle slopes, all covered in that glittering dark material that crunched beneath her feet. She had been walking for perhaps 10 minutes when she saw the first one. It was resting on a boulder ahead of her, its wings folded. At first she thought it was a piece of debris, some fragment of equipment left by a previous surveyor. Then it moved, shifting its position slightly, and she understood. A moth, or something like a moth. It was the size of her spread hand, with wings that seemed to be made of translucent membrane stretched over delicate frames. In the fog-diffused light, the wings appeared grey, almost invisible against the stone. But as she watched, a slow pulse of bioluminescence travelled across their surface, soft, blue-green, like phosphorescence in deep water, and the creature became suddenly, quietly visible. Yara stopped walking and stood very still. The moth, she would think of it as a moth, though it was certainly nothing that had ever existed on Earth, seemed unaware of her presence. It pulsed again, that gentle wave of light travelling from the centre of its body out to the edges of its wings, and she realised it was warming itself. The bioluminescence was generating heat. She stayed there for a long moment, watching. The moth pulsed 3 more times, each wave of light a little brighter than the last, and then it unfolded its wings and lifted into the fog, disappearing in seconds. Yara let out a breath she hadn't realised she was holding. She made a note in her field journal: bioluminescent aerial fauna. First sighting 0.6 kilometres northeast of station. Thermal behaviour observed. Then she continued walking. Part 3. The sample site. The depression was deeper than she had expected, a gentle bowl in the landscape, perhaps 200 metres across, its floor covered in a different kind of material than the surrounding plains. Here, the volcanic glass gave way to something finer, almost like sand, dark grey with streaks of rust red running through it. Oxidized iron, probably. She would know more once she ran the analysis. Yara made her way down the gentle slope, choosing her footing carefully. The fine material shifted slightly under her boots, not quite unstable, but requiring attention. At the bottom of the depression, she set down her pack and began to work. The soil probe was a simple tool, a hollow cylinder that she pressed into the ground to extract core samples. She chose her first location near the center of the bowl, where the rust-red streaks were most concentrated, and pushed the probe down until it met resistance. The material here was looser than she had expected, almost powdery in the top few centimeters, before compacting into something firmer below. She extracted the core and examined it. The cross-section showed clear stratification, layers of different colors and textures that told a story of geological change over thousands of years. Near the top, the dark grey material with its red streaks. Below that, a layer of lighter grey, almost white. And below that, something darker still, dense and heavy. She sealed the sample in a container and labelled it, then moved to her next collection point. The work was methodical and absorbing. She took 12 samples in total, spaced at regular intervals across the depression floor, each one carefully extracted and catalogued. The fog drifted overhead, occasionally thinning enough to reveal glimpses of the purple-grey sky. And the light shifted slowly from the dim glow of NA7's early cycle to something brighter, warmer. She had just finished sealing her final sample when she became aware that she was being watched. There were 3 of them this time. 3 moths perched on rocks at the edge of the depression. They were larger than the first one she had seen, their wingspans perhaps twice the length of her forearm, and their bioluminescence was more pronounced. Even in the growing light, she could see the soft blue-green glow pulsing across their wings. They were watching her equipment. No, not watching. That implied too much intention. They were attracted to it, to the warmth, she realized. Her portable spectrometer was generating heat as it ran its analysis on the first sample she had collected, and the moths had noticed. Yara stayed very still, observing them. They didn't seem frightened of her, nor did they seem particularly interested in her. Their attention was focused on the warm glow of the spectrometer's display, their wings pulsing in slow synchronization as if they were communicating with each other. One of them lifted off from its rock and drifted closer, landing on the edge of her equipment case. Its feet, if they were feet, made tiny scratching sounds against the hard surface. Up close, she could see more detail. The intricate patterns on its wings, like frost on a window, and the way its body was covered in fine, downy material that trapped the light and made it seem to glow from within. "Hello," Yara said softly. The moth turned its head toward her. It had a head of sorts, a small rounded shape with what might have been eyes, dark and compound and reflecting the fog light. It regarded her for a moment, wings pulsing once, twice, and then it turned its attention back to the spectrometer. Yara waited. After perhaps 5 minutes, the spectrometer completed its analysis and powered down, its display fading to dark. The warmth dissipated. One by one, the moths lost interest and drifted away, their bioluminescent wings carrying them up into the fog until they disappeared. Yara packed her equipment and began the walk back to the station. Part 4. Analysis and Evening. The data from her first samples was encouraging. Yara sat at her workbench as the light outside dimmed toward NA7's equivalent of evening, running the analysis software on her collected cores. The spectrometer had already identified the basic mineral composition: iron oxides, silicates, trace amounts of sulfur and copper. But the more detailed analysis was revealing something more interesting: organic compounds. Not life exactly, not the complex chemistry of living organisms, but the building blocks: amino acids, simple carbon chains, present in concentrations higher than she would have expected for a world this far from its star. The volcanic activity, she suspected. The heat and pressure creating the conditions for these molecules to form, then depositing them in the soil over millions of years. She made detailed notes in her field journal, sketching diagrams and jotting down questions for further investigation. Where was the highest concentration? Was it uniform across the depression or clustered in certain areas? What role did the volcanic venting play in the distribution? Outside, the fog had taken on a deeper purple hue as the gas giant's light shifted toward the dimmer end of its cycle. Through the window, Yara could see the landscape transformed into a study in shadows and soft, glowing mist. The volcanic glass fields caught what little light remained and scattered it in faint sparkles, like stars fallen to the ground. She made herself a simple dinner: rehydrated vegetables, protein paste, a piece of flatbread that was only slightly stale, and ate it sitting by the window, watching the darkness deepen. The moths appeared as the light faded. At first, there were only a few, drifting through the fog like living lanterns, their bioluminescence more visible now that the ambient light had dimmed. They moved in slow, meandering patterns, never seeming to hurry, occasionally pausing to rest on the volcanic glass or on the station's exterior walls. Then more came, and more. Within an hour, the air around the station was filled with them, dozens of moths, perhaps hundreds, their combined glow creating a soft aurora of blue-green light that rippled and shifted as they moved. They weren't approaching the station aggressively, weren't trying to get inside. They were simply drawn to its warmth, clustering in the air above the heating vent, like moths around a flame on Earth. Yara turned off the interior lights and watched. The moths danced in the darkness, their movements creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Spirals and waves and slow, lazy figure eights. Their light pulsed in rhythms that sometimes synchronized, whole groups of them glowing bright at once before fading back to dimness. She watched until her eyes grew heavy, and then she watched some more. This was what she had come here for, she realized. Not just the samples, not just the data. This, the quiet wonder of a world that had never known human presence, going about its business as it had for millions of years. She fell asleep in her chair, and the moths continued their dance outside her window. Part 5. The second day. She woke with a stiff neck and a thin blanket of grey light filtering through the window. The moths were gone, dispersed with the brightening of the gas giant's reflected glow, and the fog had thinned enough to reveal the distant shapes of volcanic ridges on the northern horizon. Yara stretched, wincing at the protest from her muscles, and put the kettle on. Coffee first, then work. Her survey plan for the day was more ambitious. A 5-kilometre traverse to the west, where satellite imagery had shown unusual thermal patterns that might indicate subsurface volcanic activity. She packed a larger bag, more sample containers, extra water, a compact shelter in case the weather turned, and set out as soon as she had finished her second cup. The landscape changed as she walked. The volcanic glass fields gave way to regions of tumbled boulders, their surfaces covered in a thin layer of mineral frost that crunched under her boots. The fog here was thinner, stirred by gentle winds that came down from the ridges, and she could see further than she had the day before, perhaps 50 meters, sometimes more. The world was beautiful in its starkness, grey and purple and the occasional rust-red streak of oxidized iron. No plants, no vegetation, nothing green. Just rock and mineral and the endless shifting fog. And yet it felt alive somehow, felt full of presence and potential. She found the thermal site after 2 hours of walking. It was a crack in the ground, perhaps 10 meters long and a meter wide, from which warm air rose in visible currents. The fog behaved differently here, swirling and eddying as the warm air met the cool, creating miniature weather patterns that were fascinating to watch. The rocks around the crack were covered in mineral deposits, bright yellow sulfur, white silica, subtle greens and blues that suggested copper and other metals. Yara set up her equipment and began to collect samples. The warmth from the vent was pleasant against her face as she worked, a reminder of the immense geological forces at work beneath the surface. Enna 7 was tidally heated, she knew, the gravitational pull of its parent gas giant creating friction in its core, keeping the interior molten despite the moon's distance from its star. This crack was a window into that internal furnace, a place where the heat of the deep found its way to the surface. She was halfway through her sample collection when the moths began to arrive. They came singly at first, drifting out of the fog and landing on the warm rocks near the vent, then in pairs in small groups until the area around the crack was covered with them, their wings spread to catch the rising heat, their bioluminescence pulsing in slow, contented rhythms. Yara stopped working and sat back on her heels, watching. There were more varieties than she had realized. The large grey ones she had seen before, yes, but also smaller ones with wings that shimmered between blue and violet. Slender ones with bodies like needles and wings like fragments of stained glass. plump ones that seemed almost fuzzy, their entire bodies covered in that light-trapping down. They paid her no attention whatsoever. She was not warm enough to interest them, not bright enough to concern them. She was simply part of the landscape, another rock for them to ignore. She found she didn't mind. Part 6. The Journal. Day 7. The mineral analysis continues to yield interesting results. The thermal vent site I discovered on Day 2 shows significantly higher concentrations of organic compounds than the initial depression, likely due to the sustained heat, creating more favorable conditions for molecular formation. I've begun mapping the distribution patterns and will submit my preliminary findings with the next data burst. The moths, I really should find a proper name for them, continue to fascinate me. They seem to follow the warmth, appearing wherever heat rises from the surface. I've identified at least 7 distinct varieties, ranging in size from smaller than my thumbnail to larger than my spread hand. Their bioluminescence appears to serve both thermal and communicative functions, though I'm not qualified to make definitive claims about the latter. Today, I watched a group of them resting on the station's heating vent for 3 hours. They arranged themselves in concentric circles, with the largest individuals at the center and the smaller ones around the periphery. Whether this represents some kind of social hierarchy or simply reflects heat distribution, I cannot say. The fog lifted briefly this afternoon, and I caught my first clear view of the gas giant. It fills a quarter of the sky when visible, banded in shades of amber and rust. Beautiful. I tried to photograph it, but the image doesn't capture the scale. I miss my daughter. I wrote her a letter that I'll include with the data burst. I hope she's keeping up with her math homework. Day 12. Rain today, if rain is the right word for it. The fog condensed into a fine mist that fell continuously for 6 hours, coating everything in a thin film of moisture. The volcanic glass fields became slippery, and I stayed close to the station, catching up on data processing. The moths disappeared during the rain, retreating, I assume, to wherever they shelter when conditions turn unfavorable. When the mist stopped, they emerged almost immediately, their numbers seeming even greater than before. Perhaps the moisture stimulates breeding, something to investigate. I've begun to recognize individual moths. There's one large female, I think of her as female, though I have no evidence for this, who frequently rests on the rock just outside my window. She has a distinctive pattern on her wings, like a spiral galaxy, and her bioluminescence has a slightly warmer tone than the others. I've named her Mira, after the variable star. Mira visited my workbench today. I had left the window cracked for ventilation while running the spectrometer, and she flew inside, attracted by the warmth. She circled the room once, landed on my equipment case, and stayed there for 20 minutes while I held perfectly still. Her wings pulsed slowly, casting shifting blue-green shadows across my notes. When the spectrometer finished and cooled, she departed through the window without looking back. I feel oddly honored. Day 19. A storm came down from the northern ridges last night, real wind for the first time since my arrival, strong enough to rattle the station's exterior panels. I lay in my bed, listening to the sounds of the atmosphere in motion. The whistle of air through the heating vents, the percussion of grit against the windows, the deeper rumble of pressure waves rolling across the volcanic plains. The moths gathered against the station's leeward side, clustering in groups for warmth and protection. Their combined bioluminescence was visible through the fog, a soft glow that pulsed and shifted as the wind gusted. Watching them, I thought about the communities we form in harsh conditions, how even the simplest creatures seek out others when the world turns difficult. The storm passed by morning, leaving the landscape changed. Sand and grit had been redistributed across the plains, covering some areas and exposing others. I found a new thermal crack 100 meters from the station, opened by the storm or simply revealed by the shifting sediment. I'll survey it tomorrow. 21 days down, 69 to go. Part 7. The Discovery. She found the egg cases on day 23. They were clustered in a shallow alcove at the base of a volcanic ridge, perhaps 50 of them, each one a translucent sphere the size of her fist. Inside each sphere, visible through the membrane, was a tiny moth larva, curled and still and glowing faintly with that familiar blue-green light. Yara approached carefully, not wanting to disturb them. The alcove was warm, another small thermal vent, too small to see, keeping the egg cases at incubating temperature. The mother moths, if that was what they were nowhere to be seen, but she imagined they visited regularly, checking on their developing young. She took photographs and measurements, but no samples. This felt different from collecting soil cores. These were living things, or soon would be, and she had no right to disturb them. She visited the alcove again the next day and the day after that. The larvae grew slowly, their bioluminescence strengthening, their tiny bodies uncurling millimeter by millimeter. By day 30, the first of them had hatched, emerging from their spheres as miniature versions of the adults, wings wet and crumpled, bodies trembling as they took their first breaths of Enna-7's cool air. Yara sat and watched them dry their wings, watched them pulse with light for the first time, watched them lift off into the fog one by one. She felt like she was witnessing something ancient, something that had happened on this moon for millions of years before humans had even learned to walk upright. Something that would continue for millions of years after she was gone. She cried a little, though she wasn't sure why. Part 8. Mira. Mira became a regular visitor. The large moth with the spiral galaxy wings seemed to have learned that the station meant warmth, and she appeared almost every evening as the light dimmed, settling on the rock outside Yara's window and pulsing her bioluminescence in slow, steady rhythms. Sometimes she stayed for hours. Sometimes she brought others with her, smaller moths who seemed to defer to her presence, clustering around her like students around a teacher. Yara began leaving the heating vent on a low setting even when she didn't need it, just to make sure Mira had somewhere warm to rest. She knew it was foolish. Anthropomorphizing, forming attachments, all the things she had been trained not to do on xenobiological surveys. But she couldn't help it. There was something about Mira's steady presence, her predictable rhythms, that felt like companionship. On day 41, Mira came inside. The window was open again. Yara had started leaving it cracked intentionally, hoping, and Mira drifted through without hesitation, as if she had been waiting for the invitation. She circled the room once, twice, her wings casting that shifting blue-green light across the walls, and then she landed on the shelf above Yara's bed, right next to the photograph of her daughter. She stayed there all night. Yara lay in bed watching her, the moth's slow pulse of light, casting moving shadows across the ceiling. It felt like having a nightlight, she thought, like sleeping in the presence of something magical and strange and utterly, unexpectedly comforting. When she woke in the morning, Mira was gone. But she came back that evening, and the evening after that, and the evening after that. And Yara began to feel, for the first time since leaving Earth, that she was not entirely alone. Part 9. The Routine. The days settled into a rhythm. Mornings, wake, coffee, check the weather patterns on the sensor display, pack equipment, walk to the survey site of the day, sometimes near, sometimes far, depending on what the data suggested and what she was curious about. Collect samples, observe the landscape, watch the moths, take notes. Afternoons, return to the station, run analyses, enter data, eat a simple lunch. Sometimes nap if the morning's walk had been long. Sometimes read from the small library of books she had brought with her. Novels mostly. Stories of other worlds and other lives. Sometimes just sit by the window and watch the fog. Evenings, dinner, more analysis if needed, or more reading or writing letters to her daughter that she would include with the regular data bursts. Wait for Mira. Watch the moths dance in the darkness outside. Sleep. It was a good routine, a peaceful routine. The kind of routine that allowed the mind to settle, allowed the anxieties and pressures of ordinary life to fade into the background like the ever-present fog. She found herself thinking differently here, more slowly, more carefully. Ideas that had seemed urgent on Earth, deadlines, promotions, the constant need to prove herself, seemed distant and faintly absurd from the perspective of NS7. What mattered here was simpler: the quality of her samples, the accuracy of her data, the warmth of her station in the endless cool air. What mattered here was paying attention. Part 10. The Storm. The second major storm came on day 52. This one was different from the first. Stronger, more sustained. The winds came down from the northern ridges like a living thing, screaming across the volcanic plains and turning the air opaque with grit and dust. Yara sealed the station and watched through the window as visibility dropped to nearly zero. The moths vanished, retreating to whatever shelters they used in weather like this. Even Mira was absent, and Yara found herself worrying about her. Ridiculous, she knew, since the moths had survived storms like this for millions of years without her concern. But still, she hoped Mira was somewhere warm. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of howling wind and rattling panels, and the strange, muffled silence that filled the station when she put on noise-cancelling headphones and tried to concentrate on her work. 3 days of cabin fever, of pacing the small space, of longing for the simple pleasure of stepping outside and feeling the fog on her face. On the third night, the wind finally began to die down. Yara stood by the window watching the dust settle, and she saw something moving in the darkness. A small light, pulsing blue-green, then another and another. The moths were emerging. They came out of the cracks and crevices where they had sheltered, their bioluminescence flickering back to life like candles being relit one by one. Within an hour, the air around the station was filled with them again, their combined glow creating that soft aurora that Yara had come to love. And there, landing on the rock outside her window, was Mira. Her wings were dusty but undamaged, her spiral galaxy pattern still visible beneath the grit. She pulsed once, twice, and then folded her wings and settled in to wait. Yara opened the window. Mira flew inside without hesitation, circled the room once, and landed on the shelf above the bed. "I missed you," Yara said. Mira pulsed her light in response. It probably meant nothing. It probably was just a thermal regulation behavior having nothing to do with communication or emotion or any of the things that humans assigned meaning to. But it felt like an answer. Part 11. The Final Weeks. The last 30 days passed more quickly than she expected. There was still work to do, always more samples to collect, more data to analyze, more questions to investigate. She had enough material now for several papers, maybe a book, a comprehensive survey of NS7's mineral composition, its organic chemistry, its thermal dynamics, and of course her observations of the moths, which she had begun to document more systematically, creating a catalogue of species and behaviors that would be the first of its kind for this world. But beneath the work, she felt time slipping away. Each morning she woke knowing there were fewer mornings left. Each evening she watched the moths dance, knowing this particular dance would never happen again. Not exactly like this, not with her as witness. She tried to pay closer attention, to notice more. The exact shade of purple in the fog at different times of day, the specific crunch of volcanic glass beneath her boots, the way Mira's wings caught the light when she circled the room, creating brief, ephemeral rainbows on the curved walls of the station. Memory, she understood now, was not just about recording. It was about being present enough that there was something worth recording. Part 12. Departure. The shuttle came on day 90, right on schedule. Yara heard it before she saw it, a distant rumble that grew into a roar, cutting through the fog like nothing else on this quiet world. She stood outside the station with her packed bags, watching the light of its engines descend, feeling the air warm and the fog churn in its wake. The pilot was a cheerful man named Esposito, who had made this run dozens of times. He helped her load her equipment, made small talk about the weather on the research vessel, asked if she had had a good rotation. Yes, Yara said. I did. She looked back at the station one more time before boarding. The fog had already begun to close around it, softening its edges, beginning the process of reclaiming it for the landscape. In a few hours, it would look as if no one had ever been there. On the rock outside the window, a large moth sat watching, wings folded, light pulsing slowly. Goodbye, Mira, Yara said, too softly for Esposito to hear. The moth pulsed once more, then lifted into the fog and disappeared. Part 13. The Return. The research vessel was bright and loud and full of people. Yara found her cabin, a small space but private, and sat on the narrow bed, feeling the hum of the engines beneath her. They would be underway soon, heading back toward the inner systems, toward Earth, towards her daughter's gap-toothed smile and the thousand small urgencies of ordinary life. She should have been happy. She was happy in a way. The rotation was complete, the work was done, and she would see her daughter in 3 weeks. That was worth more than all the quiet, fog-shrouded mornings on Enna 7. But she found herself thinking about Mira, about the moths dancing in the darkness, about the slow pulse of blue-green light that had become, over 90 days, as familiar and comforting as a heartbeat. She pulled out her field journal and opened it to the last page. She had written there, on her final evening, a few lines of observation that had felt important. The moths of Enna 7 have no awareness of human concerns. They do not know or care that I have been here, that I have watched them, that I have given them names and worried about them and felt something like love for their strange, beautiful existence. They will continue their lives, warming themselves at thermal vents, dancing in the fog, laying their eggs in sheltered alcoves, without any memory of my presence. This is as it should be. The universe does not owe us meaning. But sometimes if we are quiet enough, and patient enough, and present enough, we get to witness meaning anyway. We get to see something beautiful, something ancient, something that has nothing to do with us and everything to do with the endless, improbable fact of being alive. I am glad I came here. I am glad I paid attention. Yara closed the journal and lay back on her bed. The engines hummed. The vessel began to move. Outside her porthole, the stars wheeled slowly past. Distant suns, each one orbited by worlds she would never see, each one home to wonders she would never witness. That was all right. She had seen Enna 7. She had seen the fog, and the volcanic glass, and the moths with their spiral galaxy wings. That was enough. Epilogue. The letter. Dear Maya, I'm on my way home. 3 weeks and I'll be there to pick you up from school just like I promised. I can't wait to see how much you've grown. I want to tell you about the moths. They were beautiful, Maya. So beautiful. They glowed in the dark, like living lanterns, and they danced in the fog every evening while I watched from my window. There was one I named Mira. She was the biggest, with wings that looked like a spiral galaxy. And she used to come inside my station and sit on the shelf above my bed. I know that sounds strange, but it made me feel less lonely. Like I had a friend, even though she was just a moth on a moon 100 light years from home. I've been thinking a lot about what I want to tell you when I get back. About the universe, and how big it is, and how many amazing things are out there waiting to be discovered. About paying attention and being patient, and finding beauty in quiet places. About how the best parts of life are often the simplest ones. A cup of coffee in the morning, a letter from someone you love, a moth sitting on a rock outside your window. But mostly, I just want to tell you that I love you, and I missed you, and I'm coming home. Save some of your gap-toothed smile for me. Love always, Mom. The Ender.